All right, good morning, agents. This is Kevin Lauren. I'm the Director of Training and Marketing, and today we are going to be going over the new changes on the car forms, and we're going to be joined by Lauren Nowak, our compliance officer, also the owner of the TC Advantage. So we are pleased to have Lauren join us again. Before we get into today's presentation, I just want to go over real quick. Bill had sent out a broker tip yesterday. Bill is on vacation, as most of you know, this week. So glad that he's able to take a tiny bit of a break. He is with his family, so we're glad he's doing that. So the broker tip yesterday was about how current buyer trends have shifted. So in general, the first-time home buyers are a lot older these days. So, and here's, kind of the shifts. So marriage and kids are coming later. Most people are waiting to have kids. Our parents' generation, or the generation in the past, people were having kids when they were in their 20s. Now it's more in their 30s. So the average age of first time buyers is right around 38. So that's a full decade older than in the 90s, and even probably a little bit more than, in the 80s and 70s. So more solo living, smaller households, there's different space needs. So the 30 to 40 range is, that is our new target audience. That's the main audience for first-time home buyers. And so just wanted you guys to notice that. I'm sure most of you have, but I thought that was a good tip that Bill brought out yesterday. So let me share my screen again, or actually I'm gonna just go ahead and stop my screen share. And we are just gonna have Lauren join us. Lauren, good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely, always a pleasure to have you share your insights
Mhm.
and teach us about all these fun new changes that are going on with the car forms.
Yes. Well, I think they're fun. Okay, great. So let me get my presentation set up here.
Sounds good.
And
And so we do have a couple of new agents on the line today. Most of our regulars, of course, know Lauren as our compliance officer, as well as the owner of the TC Advantage. And so Lauren comes on our webinars occasionally. She is a CAR certified person, so she knows all about this stuff. She studies this stuff. And so we are lucky to have her.
thank you so much. Let's see. Okay, so let me share my screen.
Perfect.
Okay, everybody should be able to see that here now.
That looks clear as day. Thanks, Lauren.
Perfect. Okay, so like Kevin said, my name is Lauren Nowak. I am an owner operator of the TC Advantage. I have my real estate license. I'm also CAR certified as a forms trainer, as a transaction coordinator, and so my team and I we see it all. And forms are our wheelhouse. This is where our expertise really lies. Today, we're going to be talking about the release of the new and revised forms that came out about 2 weeks ago, the last week of June. So some of you may have seen them already out and about. There are in total about 258 CAR forms. I'm familiar with almost all of them, but it's a lot. And today we're going to be talking about, well, this release affected about 95 out of those 258. So it's a lot. It's overwhelming. Obviously, we don't have that kind of time today, so we're going to touch on just a few. But out of those 95, we're looking at about 11 new forms. Some of these are like brand new, and others are sort of the result of like reshuffling some concepts and texts from other forms to make new baby forms with different applications. There are also 32 substantive revisions to forms that you may come across on a regular basis out in the field. And then about 52 forms had revisions that don't really require any new learning. So there were changes made to the RPA. So then they also made those changes across the 7 other purchase agreements. Same thing with the listing agreement. There were changes like changing the term landlord to housing provider, removing the property address line and initials from some advisories, or they didn't make any changes at all and just simply updated the date on the form. And that's part of C.A.R's 4-year revision standard. So they make sure that they put eyes on every single form at least every 4 years and say, is this form still applicable? Do we need to make any updates? Do people still use it? Do we need to reinvent it into something different? So on and so forth. And then they retired 4 forms, mostly ones that were, 2 of them were from the transition period for the new purchase agreement and those compensation terms and listing agreement where you had to update. It was like those gap forms. Again, obviously we're not going to go over all of these updates today, but it's important that you still know where they are and how to find them, and that you're informed on what those changes are. So when you go into C.A.R.org, you go up to the top to Transaction Center, click on that, then you'll click on Standard Forms. That will take you to a list of hyperlinks. You're going to go to the Forms Revisions and New Form Releases, and then you'll click on the most recent. You can go all the way back. I mean, they have every single release hyperlinked, and you'll click on that, and that will take you to this form or this page, which these are all one big hyperlink. If you click on the new forms release and the revised forms release, it's going to take you to the same thing, but it's basically a folder with all of the red line versions of all of the forms that are being released. But the best thing to do is just click on that quick summary guide that shows kind of an overall summary of a little blurb of what was changed when it was last updated, if it's a new form, if it's a revised form, just to kind of give you an overhead view of what was tweaked. And if it's something that applies to your regular business, you can go in and then look at that specific form and see in red line what specifically was changed. So with that, let's just jump into some of these brand new forms. This is the Rental Property Owner Advisory. And this one is helpful for new housing providers. It goes into, it's 3 pages, it's 15 paragraphs that goes into all kinds of things that a new housing provider should know. Rent control, the Tenant Protection Act, disclosures, pets, notices, fair housing, emergencies, legal and tax consequences, all this kind of stuff. Because C.A.R doesn't want their agent members to act as advising lawyers on these topics. So again, this is an advisory only form. It's not a contractual form, but it's something that was created to kind of protect the agent from having to give things that may be construed as legal advice, especially when you're dealing with housing providers, rental property owners, whatever you want to call them. So this is a new advisory that they've rolled out. The next advisory is a seller in possession advisory. This does not take the place of, but is in fact, I think, bundled now with the seller in possession addendum. But this is an advisory in that same sense, letting the buyer and seller know of any risks, negotiating terms, timing issues, lender issues, things like that to consider when the buyer is going to allow the seller to remain in possession. This is not for the residential lease after sale, which is for 30 days or more for possession. That turns into a more tenant agreement. but this is sort of a license to remain when you're talking about 29 days or less for the seller to be in the property. But there are things to consider of insurance, the condition of the property upon move out, legal and tax consequences, if there's going to be any lender issues, all this kind of stuff. So these are things that should be put into place. This should be provided. Again, I think that's why it is bundled with the seller in possession addendum. But these are all points that it's really important to notify both buyer and seller about these elements. The next brand new advisory, short and sweet. We love these, less than 1 page. This is for your short-term or your vacation rental advisories. Both buyer and seller sign these. This is meant to essentially trigger the seller's knowledge or understanding when they're disclosing or notifying buyer. And then obviously for the buyer to be aware of anything, any restrictions, any inspections that they should be doing, things to consider for their vacation rental purchase. And this other new form is not an advisory. This is an agreement. This is the team member exit agreement. So there is already in C.A.R a team member and a team leader agreement, but this is for the actual exit part. If you are parting ways, why did this agreement terminate? Did it expire? Was there cause? How do you address compensation or certain expenses? Who gets to keep the fictitious business name? Who's going to tell the broker? How do you resolve disputes? So this is kind of meant to address some of those sticking points that come up a lot when a team dissolves or a team member leaves the team. Okay, so some of the changes that have been made are to the residential purchase agreement. The main one, which C.A.R does this a lot with things that are kind of brand new and we're trying to like get ahead of them or figure out the best way to execute them. And this obviously it evolves around the compensation aspect and the seller paying the buyer's obligation for their broker's compensation. So this was essentially in the beginning was kind of laid out this way, and then you can see in the bottom the most recent version in June of last year, or no, I'm sorry, December of last year. They expanded it to add all this additional stuff, and now they've shrunk it back. So the section at the top is what the RPA looks like now, and essentially they removed any reference to the buyer's obligation. They've removed the buyer's affirmation of it being a valid agreement, that it's not less than what the buyer is paying. It's laid out in the purchase agreement now and can be thought of now like a credit, just like anything else. And the purpose of this credit is to compensate the buyer's broker. So they're crediting the buyer for this specific purpose. And really the reason is to keep the seller out of the buyer's business. This is just a cost consideration for the seller. It's not the seller or the seller broker's business to be deciding if the buyer and their broker agreement is valid, what those terms are. It's irrelevant in the context of a purchase agreement between buyer and seller. At the end of the day, this is a cost consideration for the seller, and this is something that the buyer is asking to be credited from the seller, and it's to be used for a specific purpose. The reason that it was kept separate and not just thrown into seller credit to buyer for closing costs or what have you is to keep it separate for the lenders and the lending community, because they don't factor in this cost when figuring out all of those fees and costs for the buyer. So that's really the only reason why it's kept separate. The other big change is to the FHDS form. It's still confusing. It's still a confusing law, but now It's just confusing in a different order and layout. Basically, they decided to keep it as one disclosure, but they made a checkbox, as you can see up at the top of section 2, to check the box to make that section apply. So there are two elements to this. There's the fire hardening element, and then there's the defensible space element. So the fire hardening is for, it does not apply if a property is built on or after January 1st of 2010. So if that's the case, they check the box and move on. However, if the property is built prior to that date, then they need to answer these specific questions. And they've reformatted it into that same layout, essentially, of all of these additional disclosures or information. They have to disclose yes or no these low-cost retrofits that were completed during the time that they owned the property. And it's important to note that it is not similar to the SPQ and TDS in the sense that those disclosures with the yes or no checkboxes are phrased as "are you aware of?" This is not "are you aware?" This is yes or no. So the seller does need to disclose yes or no. The C.A.R legal attorneys in our trainings have specified it is safer saying no if you're not 100% sure, right? Especially when you're dealing with this. You don't want to say, yes, there is this low-cost retrofit. I'm pretty sure this retrofit was done, and then have it in fact not be done. That's a lot worse than saying, no, it's not done, and happily finding out, oh, actually it is done, and that's great. Everybody's happier that way as opposed to the other way. And then on the second page, there's also a section where they can provide an explanation or clarification if there is additional information that they want to add, same as any of these other kind of disclosures. Okay, this PRBS form looks like a lot has been done to it with all of the red and everything. It was expanded from 1 page up to 2 pages now, but really because they expanded all of the text, which I don't know why they thought people were really closely reading it in the first place, but here we are. So the biggest difference is in section C, where they broke up or they went into clarifying more about dual agency and addressing dual agency as a brokerage dual agency and then actually a single agent dual agency. Because even a lot of agents get kind of confused on this aspect, where if there are 2 agents with Alta, one is representing the seller and one is representing the buyer, that is still a dual agency. In the purchase agreement, on that page 1, talking about agency, that's a dual agency. The broker is essentially representing both sides. Then you have a single agent dual agency where one agent represents the seller and that same agent represents the buyer, if that makes sense. So this just kind of expanded all of that text, gave context to those different scenarios, and is why it looks so daunting. They just literally added more words. Okay, this form was the change that I think most TCs were the most excited about. And this is the additional signature addendum. And they really made big changes to this structurally, and they made it function a lot better. So previously it was just a whole bunch of sections where they would have additional signer 1, 2, 3, and then they would just sign their name and then initial for liquidated damages and arbitration. The problem with that form was that technically you were supposed to have one for every single document where you had an additional signature, which was fine when this form first came out and you had like a 6-page purchase agreement and like your agency. But now even just the purchase agreement bundles and all these different document bundles and groupings, it's like started to be inefficient because you had just as many additional signature addendums as you did actual forms they were signing. People tried to cram all of the form names onto one thing. It just was a big pain. And as a TC, and it's just easier for us to throw on 4 initials onto a document and cram them in there than to deal with this additional signature addendum. So, having said that, they've made some changes to this form, and you can see they've created this bundle section so that instead of having to draw out or write out every single document included, because you can't just say the contract or the purchase agreement docs, right? Legally, you have to lay out and say the name of every single document. So they made these bundles. So you can check a box and say, okay, these are the forms that we're adding this name to: the listing agreement, the purchase agreement, the buyer representation agreement, your rental agreement, if there's specific disclosures. And then there's the other box. But if you've seen any of my presentations before, you know how I feel about blank lines for agents to fill things out. It tends to give people the impression that they can be attorneys and gets them into trouble. So stay away from blank paragraph spaces as much as you can. But essentially, this is super helpful. So the other thing that you'll notice is that liquidated damages arbitration section that used to be under every single signature line on the form. They have removed that because they have put it on its own form. The reason for that is liquidated damages arbitration was only applicable to the purchase agreement. So if you're using the additional signature addendum for the RPA, the PRBS, all of those forms in the bundle, you don't have liquidated damages and arbitration on every single one of those forms. You don't have it on the buyer representation agreement. You don't have it on the listing. So it didn't make sense to incorporate those terms for all of those other documents. So this form is separate for when you are adding, you have additional signatures associated with the purchase agreement, because again, the terms of liquidated damages and arbitration require separate acknowledgement and agreement. So again, that's why in counteroffers, a lot of people don't read those default pre-typed paragraphs on the counteroffers, but they do state that if either liquidated damages or arbitration are not initialed on the purchase agreement by either party, then they don't apply. So it does need separate acknowledgement. Okay, I am hesitant to even tell anybody about this form that exists, but this is a new addendum that C.A.R has released, and this is a generic addendum. The reason being, sometimes there are agreements that are not necessarily between the buyer and the seller. There is an agreement that is, sometimes there's the agent, sometimes there's the broker, sometimes there are a lot of different applications that people were running into where they were like crossing out the word seller and writing in the agent or the inspector, whatever. I don't know. There are all these different applications. And so they've created this generic addendum. It is still meant to add terms to an existing agreement, essentially. This isn't just like a standalone kind of contract or agreement. But it does, instead of having buyer and seller, it has principal 1 and principal 2. So you can differentiate up at the top where this agreement addendum applies, whether it's, again, to your representation agreements, which for the most part, you can use a modification of terms on that, but a team agreement, things like that. So this may come in handy if you're looking for something that you need to put something in writing, and that the buyer and seller signers don't necessarily apply. along those same lines, they've added another amendment. So one point of clarification that I feel is really important is to remember the difference between addendum and amendment. So if you are adding terms that did not exist previously, you are doing an addendum. If you are adding a credit that did not exist previously in the contract, you are going to add it on an addendum. If you are amending, if you are changing terms that currently exist, you are using an amendment. Previously, there was one amendment, the AEA, Amendment to Existing Agreement, and technically that should be used for things that, let's say your purchase agreement has seller in possession for 5 days after close of escrow, and you need to amend that to be 10 days after close of escrow. You would use the AEA form, an amendment of existing agreement, to amend that term. So now there is an additional amendment, which is the amendment to a prior disclosure. And this is for amending, making changes to disclosures that were previously provided, specifically TDS and SPQ. But if you have your solar disclosure or things like that, you can use it for that as well. Anything where you would have provided it, you can do that. So this is the seller. So that's important too, because this isn't for your Avid if you need to change your Avid, because this is the seller making an amendment to a prior disclosure. But let's say you were in escrow, the escrow canceled. Before it went into escrow again, the seller made some changes to the property. They can just use this amendment to amend those terms in, you know, the TDS or the SPQ or whatever in that disclosure package, so they don't have to redo the whole thing all over again. And again, this is an amendment. This is not adding to. You're making changes to. You're amending the existing disclosure. That is kind of it for the main substantive disclosures. The other ones that I wanted to touch base on, let me pull them up here. Let's see here. I think it'll let me share a different window. They did change the move in, move out form to be two separate forms. So you now have a move-in inspection. And again, this is really to conform with the changes to being able to provide photographs to take into consideration upon move out of the property condition. And so then they obviously have a separate move out inspection, which goes into the difference between your security deposit. This is letting, you know, kind of the housing provider know what to document and what considerations are taken. And then this gets signed off by, again, the tenant and the housing provider and that sort of a thing. So instead of it being that one combined document, it is two separate documents. And then the other one that you may come across is the referral fee agreement. And this they did restructure a little bit as well, in being more specific, instead of kind of those blank lines where you just sort of fill out that information. You would differentiate, really kind of, what is the referral for? Is there compensation due at closing, regardless of if it's outside that representation period? And then the agent's obviously initial for acknowledgement of receipt, which is a nice addition. And then they also did kind of clarify up here. There was a lot of confusion when they were talking about the referring broker, referring agent, and receiving agent, because there was confusion of like, oh, well, I'm receiving the referral fee, so I'm the receiving agent. But that's not the way that it should be. You have the agent giving the referral of the contact, and then the agent receiving the referral of the person, and not necessarily the referral fee. So they tried to kind of clarify that again by saying recipient representing agent. So who's representing this referral? A lot of times when agents talk about, oh, this, I have this referral, they have kind of the fee in mind. So that was creating some confusion. What else? I think those are kind of the main ones. Again, there were all of those kind of changes, adjustments, and tweaks, that I really recommend you kind of go through that summary and see, really if there's any that apply. But that general summary, the quick summary from C.A.R, will really help you in figuring all that out. So I think that's probably the shortest one that I've ever done. Um, and
Probably right.
but yeah, that's all I've got.
Perfect. Well, Lauren, thank you so much. This is so important for us to stay on top of all these things, and so we appreciate your guidance in this. And if you guys have questions, you can of course direct them towards Lauren. But we really do appreciate it, Lauren, and I hope you have a great day.
Yes, thank you. You as well.
All right, perfect. Well, in that case, agents, get out there, make it a great week and a productive week, and we will see you guys as well as Bill Seitz, the broker, back on the webinar next Wednesday. Bye-bye.